Hello my friends, welcome back. Now let's learn together how to import a dataset. As a reminder, we're going to learn how to import the following dataset, data.csv, which is a very simple dataset of, let's say, a retail company that is doing some analysis on which clients purchased one of their products. So the rows in this dataset correspond to different customers of this employee, and for each of these customers we have the country they live in, their age, their salary, and whether or not they purchased the product. Okay, so we're going to learn how to import that CSV on Python using, of course, the Pandas library. Here we go. So let's first create a new code cell, and now let's import this dataset. So the first thing we have to do is to create a new variable. And this variable will contain exactly the dataset. So I always like to choose simple names for my variables, representing well what we're creating. And therefore, since now we're importing the dataset and we want to integrate the dataset in a variable, I'm going to call this variable dataset. Okay, as simple as that. So this variable, what will it be equal to? Well, it will be equal to the output of a certain function by Pandas. And this certain function will exactly read all the values of this dataset and will create what we call a data frame. It's a certain format of data, whether it is in Python or even R. So it will create a data frame and it will contain exactly the same rows and columns and values as what you see here, and this data frame will be exactly this dataset variable. Alright, so there we go. In order to create this data frame, we're going to call a certain function by the Pandas library, which is called read_CSV. And in this function, we will only have to input the name of the dataset with the extension. So, since we're about to call a function of Pandas, well, the first thing we have to do is call the Pandas library. And therefore, remember, since we gave it the shortcut name PD, in order to call it, we need to add here PD. And then to call a function from a library, we need to add a dot. It's always done like that. And that's where you can call the function you want to use. And as we said, this function is named read_CSV, and then you add some parentheses to enter the argument. So there we go, let's do this. This will only what you will have to do when using this read_CSV function. You have to input in quotes the name of the dataset. As a reminder, the name of the dataset is data with a capital D.csv. So there we go, data.csv. Okay, and this will create the data frame, all the values inside this dataset, and this data frame will be exactly this dataset variable. Okay, so that's the first step, but that's not enough to import the dataset, as a first step of data preprocessing. The next thing that you have to do is create two new entities. The first one is the matrix of features, and the second one is the dependent variable vector. So let me show you exactly what they mean and what they are in the dataset right here. Okay, so I'm going to give you now a very first important principle in machine learning. In any dataset with which you're going to train a machine learning model, you have the same entities, which are the features and the dependent variable vector. Can you guess here what are the features and what is the dependent variable? Well, very simply, the features are the columns with which you're going to predict the dependent variable. And the dependent variable, of course, is the last column, because this company would like to predict if some future customers are going to purchase a certain product based on these informations. So very simply, the features, or also called the independent variables, are the variables containing some information with which you can predict what you want to predict, which is called the dependent variable. Alright, so remember this, very important principle. In any machine learning model that you're going to build, you're going to have separately the features, usually in the first columns of your dataset, and the dependent variable, usually in the last column of your dataset. You will see that all the datasets we will use in this course, and most of the datasets you'll use in your machine learning career, will have the same format, with first the features, in the first columns, and the dependent variable vector in the last column. Okay? And so right now, what we want to create, the two entities we want to create are first the matrix of features containing separately these three columns here, country, age, salary, and separately we want to create the dependent variable vector containing only this last column, because that's the column we want to predict. And that's exactly what we always have to do in this first data preprocessing phase. So let's do this. Let's create these two entities, and we're going to call them X for the matrix of features and Y for the dependent variable vector. All right, so let's do this. Starting with X. So how are we going to create X? Basically, that's simple. We have our data set, containing exactly all these columns. And in order to create X, well, we simply have to take the 3 first columns of this data set, because X will be exactly all these values here, with the 3 first columns. And so what we're simply going to do is play with the indexes to collect indeed the indexes of these 3 first columns, basically of all the columns of the data set except the last one. So let's do this. Let me show you how to do this. First, what you're going to do is take your data set, that exact same variable which you created in this first line of code here, okay? Data set. Then from this data set, and I'm adding a dot here because we're about to use a function, one of the attribute functions of a Pandas data frame, and that function is iLoc. And what will it allow us to do? Well, as you can see, iLoc here stands for locate indexes, and therefore what this function will do is it will take the indexes of the columns we want to extract from the dataset. Not only the indexes of the columns, but also the indexes of the rows. And actually, we have to start here with the rows. We can specify the rows that we want to get and put into X. And of course, these are all the rows. We want to get all the rows into X. We only want to take the first columns, but we want to keep all the rows. And the trick to take all the rows, whatever dataset you have with whatever number of rows, is to add here a colon. Why is that? Because a colon in Python means a range. And when we specify a range without the lower bound and neither the upper bound, that means in Python that we're taking everything in a range, therefore here all the rows. So that's the trick to take all the rows, and you will always have to take all the rows, so here you won't have anything to change. Then now we have to specify which columns we want to select with the indexes, and to separate the rows that we just took from the columns, we need here to add a comma, and now we can take care of the columns. Alright, so now I'm going to show you a trick in order to take all the columns except the last one. Because indeed, as I told you, most of the data sets you will use to train your machine learning models will have first the features, in the first columns, and last the dependent variable vector in the last column. So now we're going to use a trick so that we can take automatically, regardless of the number of columns in your data set, all the columns except the last one. Because all the columns except the last one are exactly the matrix of features. And the trick to do that is to add a new range here, which this time will be colon -1. So what does it mean? Well, as we said, the colon here means the range. We know we're taking a range. Here on the left we have nothing. That means that we're taking the first index, the index 0, because indexes in Python start at 0. And then, we're going up to -1. So what does this -1 mean? Well, -1 means here the last column. -1 in Python means the index of the last column. However, and that's a very important principle in Python which you must absolutely know, a range in Python includes the lower bound, therefore we're including here the lower bound 0, the index 0, but excludes the upper bound. And therefore here we're excluding this index -1, meaning the index of the last column. And therefore, what this will do is it will take all the columns excluding the last one. And that's exactly what we want for our matrix of features X. So voila, there you go. Now you just collected the right indexes to create your matrix of features X. And the beauty of this is that you won't have anything to change when creating the future matrices of features X of your future datasets. But make sure that your future datasets indeed have the features in the first columns and the dependent variable vector in the last column. Okay? Perfect. So in order to finish this line of code, we just need to add here dot values. And this just means that we're taking indeed all the values in all the rows of this dataset and in all the columns except the last one of this dataset. Perfect. So now you're learning a lot. Don't worry if this feels a bit overwhelming at the beginning. I promise you that we will use this trick many, many times, so you will just soon be so familiar with it and master it like a pro. Alright, and now let's do the same for our dependent variable vector. And this will be exactly the same. We'll just have to change one little thing. So I'm going to copy this and paste it right here. And now, according to you, based on what I've just explained, what do we have to change here in order to get the dependent variable vector, which is most of the time, and in our data set indeed, the last column? Okay, so let's see. First, okay, we have to take our data set because we want to extract this last column from our data set. Then we have to use iLoc to collect the indexes of the rows and columns we want. Then we indeed want to take all the rows of the data set because we want to take all the purchase decisions of these customers, whether or not they decided to purchase yes or no the product. So okay, we want all the rows, but then which columns do we want to get here? Well, we only want to get the last column. So according to you, what is the index we need to input here in order to get only the last column? Well, this time, since we only want to get one column, we definitely don't want to get a range. And therefore, I'm going to remove the range here. And then, what are we left here? We're left here with -1. And as I've told you, -1 is exactly the index of the last column. So there we go. That's exactly what we need to create this dependent variable vector. And thus, this line of code is done. Congratulations, now you know how to import a dataset, create a matrix of features, and create a dependent variable vector. And the cherry on the cake is that anytime you want to create these for your datasets, you won't have anything to change because this will automatically take all the first columns for the matrix of features and the last column for the dependent variable vector. Alright, so now I'm going to show you indeed that X and Y will be well created. And in order to do this, we're going to add a new code cell here, inside which we're just going to print. So that's the famous print function, which allows you to print anything, whether it is a text or, an array like X or a vector like Y. So we're going to first print X, and then I'm going to add a new code cell here where we're going to print Y. And this is just to show you that indeed X and Y will well be created with this code. Okay, so let's do this. Now, time for the fun part. We're going to execute all these cells here because, so far we've just written the implementations, but we have to run the cells in order to build all this. So let's first run this code cell importing the libraries. All right, so import it. As you can see, if I click here, yes, this one here means it is executed. Now time to run the second one, but before running this, we have to do something very important. It is to upload this dataset here in CSV format inside our Google Colab notebook. And to do this, you just need to click Files here, this little folder, then Upload. Then you're going to go to this whole machine learning A to Z folder containing all the codes and dataset and which was provided to you in the first section. And I will give it to you again in every section so that you make sure not to miss it. And inside this folder, you're going to go now to part 1, data preprocessing, in order to get indeed that data CSV file containing the dataset we are importing right now. So open, and now the dataset will be indeed in Google Colab, your notebook, and so now we can run this cell to import it. And there we go, it is already imported, it is executed. So now we're gonna execute this cell in order to print the matrix of features X, just to check that indeed we get all the first columns inside this matrix. And indeed, well, let's check the dataset once again. Remember, the first column is meaning the features we wanted to get into this matrix X are first the country, second the age, and third the salary. These are the 3 columns. And indeed, inside X, we have first the country column with all the countries of these customers, their age, and in the third column, their salary or their estimated salary. So that's perfect. We get indeed the matrix of features X containing all the features, or also called the independent variables. All right, and now let's run this cell to print Y, the dependent variable vector, and indeed it gets the dependent variable vector containing all the decisions whether or not the customers purchased the product, right? We can check no, yes, no, 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 yes, no, no. Okay, so that's in the same order. That's perfect. We now have our dataset, our matrix of features X, and our dependent variable vector Y. And lastly, let me remind why we had to create these 2 entities. That's because the way we're going to build our future machine learning models expects exactly these two entities in their inputs. We will use some classes to build these models, and these classes don't expect the dataset as a whole, but these two separate entities. And that's the only reason why we had to create these two separate entities. So now you know, and therefore, congratulations. Not only you improve your knowledge of machine learning, but also you now know how to import a dataset and create a matrix of feature and a dependent variable vector. So now we're going to proceed to the next step, which is a new tool which I'm going to teach you, and that is taking care of missing data. Indeed, as you can see, the dataset contains some missing data right here. You can see this is an empty cell. So I will teach you exactly how to handle that case, which happens most of the time in datasets. So let's do this in the next tutorial, and until then, enjoy machine learning.